Okay, let's see. Number 12, Planchette. Your fingertips rest on polished wood. The room is still, except for the tiny scratch of graphite. A little board on casters trembles, then glides, writing in loops no one in the parlor will fully claim. In 1853, that movement promised something intoxicating. No more vague knocks from the table. No more waiting for a medium to translate. A direct line from the unseen, turned into handwriting before your eyes. Within a decade, American families could buy that thrill off the shelf for as little as $1. By 1891, the same basic machine had been repackaged, patented, and reduced in official language to a toy or game. That is the first disappearance in this story. A method people swore required sensitivity, ritual, and practice became a novelty anyone could purchase. Knowledge that once took generations to master collapsed into a mass-market object. Something was lost. Someone made money on the loss. The paper is fresh. The pencil point is sharp. 3 hands settle on the basket lightly enough that each person can later say they barely touched it at all. You are in a French séance room in 1853, watching a problem turn into an invention. The old method is too slow. 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, a scatter of knocks for letters, if everyone is patient enough to count them. But patience is what breaks first. The table answers late. It answers badly. It answers in ways that always seem just theatrical enough to make believers lean forward and skeptics smile. So the rules change. A pencil is fixed into a small wooden board, not a grand machine, not brass and coils and polished glass. Just a little platform, light enough to move, stable enough to carry graphite. Hands rest on top. The point touches paper. For a second, nothing happens except the soft drag of wood over cloth, and the breathing of people trying very hard not to breathe too loudly. Then the board starts to creep. It does not leap. That would almost be easier. It shivers, hesitates, drifts left, corrects right, and begins to draw the first dark line across the page. The room changes with it. Knocks are noise. This feels like language. The little machine is not detecting a spirit the way a gauge detects pressure. It is giving presence a hand. If something invisible is in the room, this is how it writes. The pencil scratches faster now. Curbs. Stops. Another hard pull. Someone gasps, then swallows it. No one wants to interrupt the sentence by sounding too alive. The board writes badly, but badly is enough. A blotched letter still counts as a letter. A broken word still lands harder than any rap from under a table. Once graphite moves over paper, the séance no longer depends on memory. It leaves evidence. You can hold the page up to the lamp. You can pass it around. You can argue over what a word means, but you cannot argue that a word-shaped thing now exists where the page was blank a minute ago. So the room tries again. Years pass. The candles get cleaner. The wood gets cheaper. The miracle gets packaged. Now you are in New York in the 1860s, and the parlor has changed. The same hush is there, but the object in the middle of the table is no longer improvised. It is finished, boxed, sold. Kirby & Company offers Kirby's Planchette in multiple versions, at prices from $1 to $8. The ghostwriting machine has entered the world of catalogs, household purchases, and family entertainments. You do not need to know a medium. You do not need to be invited into the right circle. You need money, a table, paper, and at least one person willing to place fingertips on polished wood and wait for the scratch to begin. A family opens the box. The planchette is smaller than they expected. That is part of the charm. Children are told to watch. Adults say they are only trying it for amusement. A sheet is laid out. The pencil is fitted through the opening. Someone laughs too early, because laughter gives cover if nothing happens. Someone else says to use only the lightest touch. They lower their fingers. The board moves almost at once, not far. An inch, then 2, a wobble, a circle, a hard diagonal that nearly snaps the pencil point. The mother pulls back, swears she did not push. The son insists he felt a tug to the right. The uncle, who came specifically to smirk, stops smirking when the graphite begins to gather into repeated marks. One downward stroke, another. Then a loop. Then a string of half-formed letters no one can read until the page is lifted and turned. This is how the planchette wins people, not with clarity, with participation. Every hand is implicated, but no hand can quite take credit. The writing arrives through the group, and seems to belong to none of them. That uncertainty is the whole engine. If the device sat motionless, it would be a toy. If it wrote perfect script, it would look fraudulent. Instead, it produces exactly the right texture of doubt. Messy enough to feel real, real enough to feel dangerous. Another sheet, another attempt. A name this time, or something close to one, then a phrase, then furious crossing lines, as if the thing beneath their fingers has become impatient with their slowness. The pencil rasps so hard that flakes of graphite dust gather near the edge of the page. One person removes a hand, and the movement weakens. The hand returns, and the board surges again. No one says it directly, but everyone in the room understands the bargain. If this works, the dead no longer need a specialist to speak. The instrument has collapsed the distance. Whatever training, ritual, or long habit once belonged to spirit communication is being shrunk into an object sold by mail and carried home under one arm. The room feeds in another sheet. Now the scene shifts again. Washington, winter, February 10th, 1891. You are not in a darkened seance parlor now. You are in an office where claims are supposed to be flattened into paperwork. Elijah J. Bond has brought in a device for patent number 446,054. Charles Kennard is tied to the venture. Helen Peters, a medium, is part of the demonstration that later accounts will remember, because later accounts always remember the moment a room designed for procedure lets superstition in. The board on the desk is larger now, the system cleaner. The patent will describe a board about 15 by 22 inches, around 3/8 of an inch thick. The alphabet is no longer waiting to be scratched onto paper, one shaky loop at a time. It is already laid out. The moving piece no longer needs to write, it only has to point. That change happens in plain sight. The old Planchette carried a pencil and made marks. This new descendant strips the pencil away. It removes the labor of handwriting. It turns the board itself into language. Faster, simpler, easier to sell. Bond wants approval. The story that survives says the chief patent officer is unconvinced, so Helen Peters places her fingers on the pointer and the device spells out his name. Maybe it happens exactly that way. Maybe Bond already knows the name, and the room chooses not to look too hard at how. In that moment, only one thing matters. The machine performs. Then the language of the state closes over it like a lid. Not oracle, not medium, not instrument of the dead. A toy or game. Number 11. Ouija Board. On February 10th, 1891, Elijah J. Bond stood in Washington, D.C., inside the U.S. Patent Office, with a sheet of paper that mattered more than any seance testimony ever could. Bond was a Baltimore patent attorney. He was not filing for a church relic or a scientific detector. He was filing for patent number 446,054, a board the government would recognize as a toy or game. Beside him was his sister-in-law, Helen Peters, known as a medium. On the desk sat a flat rectangle, about 15 by 22 inches, roughly 3/8 of an inch thick, with letters already printed across its face and a pointer designed to glide over them. Earlier spirit devices had needed scratching, writing, labor. This one cut all of that away. It made language instant. It looks minor until you see what changed. A pencil leaves evidence. A pointer leaves movement. Movement is easier to trust because your own hands can insist they barely did anything. The famous story says the patent officer demanded proof. If the board could spell his name, the application would proceed. Peters and Bond placed their fingers on the indicator. The indicator moved. The letters fell into sequence. The name appeared. Whether it happened exactly that way in later retellings almost does not matter. Bond understood where the real performance was taking place. Not in the supernatural claim, in the legal one. The board did not need to prove it could contact the dead. It needed to fit inside the American machinery of paper, ownership, and sale. So the state did something strange. It took an object born from seance culture and flattened it into a product category. Not ritual, not revelation, a game. Bond did not carry this thing into Washington wrapped in occult language. He wrapped it in commercial language because commercial language lasts. Hard-won knowledge about fraud, suggestion, and the ways people fool themselves had taken generations to build. Stage magicians knew it. Skeptical investigators knew it. Even experienced spiritualists knew how easily hands could guide a result. The board slipped past that entire argument by refusing to enter it. It did not ask to be believed as science. It asked to be stocked. After the patent was granted, the board moved out of the dim room and into the bright one. Charles Kennard's company sold it as a parlor novelty. By 1892, the growth was already absurd. One factory in Baltimore became two in Baltimore, two in New York, two in Chicago, and one in London. 7 production sites within roughly a year of the patent. You can hear the shift in the numbers. A handmade seance aid becomes an industrial object. A private ritual becomes mass retail. Mass retail protects it. A medium can be rated. A toy can be advertised. Bond did not live to become the face most people associate with the board. That role would pass to William Fuld, the businessman who turned Ouija into a brand. Bond is the hinge. He handled the most delicate transformation of all. He took something culturally radioactive and got it certified by the same government that certified hinges, bottle caps, and mechanical improvements. He moved the fight to different ground. After that, the issue was no longer whether the device worked. The issue was what kind of object society would allow it to be. Legally, it remained a game. Socially, it began to mutate. Churches condemned it as divination. Horror culture later recoded it as a possession trigger. Parents treated it as a contamination risk. Schools treated it as misconduct. In the United States, that produced a contradiction almost too neat to ignore. The board stayed legal enough to buy, but suspect enough to purge. It was not banned in the clean statutory sense. It was quarantined, removed from shelves, forbidden in homes, burned for symbolism, confiscated in classrooms, feared far beyond anything its patent language ever promised. The fear kept growing because the board exploits a brutal loophole in human experience. You place your fingers lightly on a planchette. You do not feel yourself pushing. The object moves anyway. In 2012, a study published in Consciousness and Cognition put 27 university students through exactly that kind of test. When they guessed answers normally, they landed at about 50% accuracy. When they used the Ouija-style setup, the guessed answers rose to 65%. Not because spirits improved their trivia scores, but because the board appears to let non-conscious knowledge leak into motion. Your body knows more than the conscious version of you admits. The ideomotor effect is not dramatic. It is more invasive than that. The deception happens through your own muscles. That matters because Bond's board did not become dangerous by emitting anything. No beam, no frequency, no ectoplasmic signal. Its power was interpretive. It let people misread themselves in real time. Then a culture could take that self-misreading and call it demonic, corrupting, or socially contagious. At that point, the object had a life entirely separate from its patent. You can still see it long after Bond, long after the factories, long after Parker Brothers bought the rights from the Fuld family in 1967, and the board became even more normalized as a mass-market game. The legal category held. The panic held too. In 2011, in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, a woman named Lucy Wiebe walked into a store and found glow-in-the-dark Ouija boards in the toy aisle. Not in a hidden occult shop, not behind a curtain, in the toy aisle. She complained on community radio. The store pulled them almost immediately. A company spokesperson said they were removed within 30 seconds. 30 seconds. A legal retail product, then community contraband. That is Bond's real legacy. Not a gateway to the dead. A template for survival through classification. A device enters the world under one name and lives in culture under another. That makes prohibition slippery. The state calls it a game. The public treats it like a curse. Experts explain unconscious movement, but folklore keeps the stronger grip because folklore is easier to carry than method. The people who benefit are not the ones who spent generations learning how belief can be manufactured. It is the ones who can sell the feeling anyway. So Elijah Bond's board was never simply accepted, and it was never fully banned. It was something more durable than either. Licensed by paper, powered by suggestion, feared as if the patent itself had certified a haunting, a toy, or game. Number 10. Spirit Trumpet. In the early 1850s, on a farm in Athens County, Ohio, Jonathan Coons led visitors into a room built for the dark. They called it the Spirit Room. Sitters packed onto benches. The lamps went out. Then the performance began. Instruments rattled. Objects seemed to lift. Music came from places where no hands should have been. The key upgrade was smaller and simpler. A horn about 2 feet long, roughly 4 inches across at the bell. It was light enough to move in darkness and narrow enough to aim a voice with precision. Brandon Hodge's research points to Kunz's son, Nahum, as the likely inventor of the speaking trumpet used for spirit voices. Once the dead could do more than knock, the seance changed shape. A rap is slow. A voice is immediate. A voice can flatter, threaten, identify itself, whisper a secret straight into one person's ear. The claim was enormous. Not signs from spirits, but speech itself, coming out of the dark and into the living world. By the 1920s, the trumpet was no longer a rustic curiosity. It had become standard hardware. In Manchester, the Two Worlds publishing company sold an ideal, luminous spirit trumpet built for voice phenomena. The surviving Cambridge example is cardboard, not mystical metal. That detail matters. Cardboard is cheap, light, easy to extend, easy to carry, easy to replace if damaged. Some versions telescoped to 2 or 3 feet. Some were painted or taped with luminous bands, so sitters could watch the cone float in total darkness. That glow did 2 jobs at once. It gave the audience just enough visual proof to anchor the miracle. It also concealed the method by pulling the eye toward the bright rings and away from the black hand, black rod, black wire, or black sleeve moving behind them. The myth said the trumpet was needed because spirit voices were too weak to form on their own. The object was treated like an etheric amplifier. The engineering points the other way. It was localizing a human voice. Start with the build. A cone takes a sound made at one end and projects it hard at the other. Whisper into open air, and it dies in the room. Whisper through a tube, and the sound arrives concentrated, intimate, almost invasive. If the bell ends up 6 inches from your ear in a black room, the brain does the rest. Distance disappears. Direction turns uncertain. You do not hear a person across the circle. You hear a presence beside your face. Because the trumpet is light, the operator does not need much force. A cardboard cone can be nudged with fingers. An aluminum one can be lifted and aimed with a rod, or by hand if the dark is deep enough. Add luminous paint, and every tiny movement becomes spectacle. The audience sees a glowing shape drift through black space, but the visible part is the least important part of the device. The mechanism is proximity. George Valentine shows how far this went. Born in 1874, dead in 1947, he became one of the best-known direct voice mediums in America. His seances used a 3-section aluminum cone, marked so it could be tracked in darkness. The advertised wonder was simple: independent spirit voices speaking through the trumpet, while the medium remained under control. That claim started to break at the point of control. Harry Houdini had spent years chasing mediums who insisted that proper darkness was not a convenience, but a condition. He stopped arguing about ectoplasm and treated the seance like a technical problem. In 1924, he described a test in which Valentine sat on a chair wired to an adjoining room light. If the medium rose, the circuit changed, and the signal exposed it. Dictographs monitored the sitting. A phosphorescent button gave observers a fixed visual point in the dark. No theology, no grand theory. Instrument against instrument. That test sounds modern, because Houdini understood the spirit trumpet as a communications device. In a 1922 Popular Radio article, he did not describe it like a relic of superstition. He described hidden telephone-style parts: a receiver, a receiving coil, a concealed accomplice transmitting a voice. The picture changes immediately. Not candles and vapors, hardware, signaling, routing. The seance trumpet sat on the border between Victorian ghost theater and early 20th century telecom. The same culture learning how to send voices over wires was being told that other voices could arrive from the dead. The miracle did not need to beat modern technology. It only needed to borrow its logic. Look at the object that way, and the clues stop looking mystical. They start looking practical. Why luminous bands? Because in complete darkness, a sitter needs something to see. Why telescoping sections? Because a collapsible cone is easier to conceal, transport, and suddenly produce. Why aluminum? Because it is durable and light. Why the insistence on darkness? Because darkness does not create voices. It protects bodies in motion. Even the old explanation that spirits needed a trumpet because they lacked strength quietly admits the core fact. The device directs sound physically through space. The seance was never escaping mechanics. It depended on them. The famous promise of direct voice had a built-in weakness. If a spirit must speak through a cone, then the cone can be tested. Its range can be measured. Its angle can be exploited. Its source can be faked. That is exactly what happened on May 18, 1926, in Washington, D.C., during hearings over a proposed ban on fortune-telling. Houdini did not arrive with a lecture on gullibility. He arrived with a demonstration. Before the House District of Columbia Committee, he took a long spirit trumpet and put it to the ear of Representative William C. Hammer. Edith Norris Rogers was there too. Then, Houdini silently whispered through the tube. Not loudly, not theatrically, only the target heard it. That was the point. One person hears a voice no one else can place. The room sees the apparatus. The mind supplies the dead. A trick that had haunted dark parlors for decades looked cheap under committee lighting. Even there, the category stayed slippery. The trumpet itself was not exactly contraband. There was no clean federal label reading banned device. What lawmakers were circling was the business around it. Paid mediumship, paid fortune-telling, paid manufacture of certainty. So this object sits in the record, less as prohibited hardware than as evidence. Exhibit, not outlaw. Evidence teaches replication. It shows how little machinery is required to produce conviction. Picture the geometry. A cone, a dark room, a sitter held still. A voice delivered inches from skin. No need for spirits, no need even for much volume, just placement, just control of where the sound lands and what the witness cannot see. That is why the trumpet survived so long. It did not need a complicated doctrine. It only needed human hearing to work the way hearing works. On that May afternoon in 1926, Houdini held the trumpet to Hammer's ear. The message came through the metal like breath from nowhere. In that moment, the seance device stopped looking like a relic of superstition. It looked like a portable machine for manufacturing a witness. Number 9. Spirit Slate. On July 13, 1876, Henry Slate arrived in England after 15 years of notoriety in America and took rooms at 8 Upper Bedford Place, near Russell Square. His equipment fit on a tabletop. One small table, one ordinary slate, one crumb of slate pencil. The sitting fee, 20 shillings. The claim, the dead would write. Start with the mechanics. A spirit slate was powerful because it did not look mechanical. A child's writing slate, cleaned in front of the sitter. A tiny fragment of pencil placed between slates or under one slate. The medium holds it under the table or presses it against the underside. Then comes the sound, a few seconds of scratching. Not a voice, not an apparition, just a sound everybody in a schoolroom already knew, writing. When the slate comes back up, there is a message, usually brief, usually pious, often just specific enough to feel intimate. Ordinary objects lower resistance. A cabinet full of wires asks to be doubted. A school slate does not. You can wipe it. You can touch it. You know what it is for. The trick starts there, with trust already built into the object. Common methods were brutally simple. One option, a pre-written slate introduced at the right second. Another, a false flap, a thin extra surface hiding text underneath until it is shifted or removed. Another, a slate-colored covering that makes writing vanish until the reveal. Another, straight substitution. The sitter thinks one slate stayed in view, another took its place. And then there is the method described in court, a thimble carrying a pencil point, hidden by the hand and controlled with elastic, so the medium can make the scratching himself. No motors. No chemistry, no electricity, just timing measured in seconds and movement measured in inches. In September 1876, zoologist Ray Lancaster and physician Horatio Bryan Donkin paid to see it work. Two men trained to notice sequence, interruption, and hand position. Slade cleaned the slate. Slade arranged the table. Slade began the familiar performance. Lancaster watched the numbers that mattered in any fraud. The delay between cleaning and placement. The throat clearing before the key movement. The arm motion before the slate went where the spirit was supposed to write. The writing was meant to happen out of sight. The only honest test was to collapse the time window. So he did. At the critical moment, Lancaster seized the slate. The message was already there. That fact cut straight through the seance script. If the writing was present before the slate reached its supposed position, then the sound had not documented creation. It had documented theater. The scratching was not proof. It was cover. The exact method remains slippery. That is what makes this case useful. Fraud was exposed in one sitting, but the full mechanism was never pinned down beyond dispute. Was Slade using a pre-written slate, a concealed writing point, a switch? Hostile witnesses and sympathetic defenders never fully agreed. That uncertainty mattered, because a trick does not need one method to survive. It only needs a repeatable result. By October 2, 1876, the affair had moved from parlor to Bow Street Police Court. The allegations centered on conspiracy to defraud, not blasphemy, not unauthorized contact with the afterlife. Fraud. The law was looking at the transaction. 20 shillings changes hands. A domestic object is presented as transparent proof. A result is manufactured. The issue was not whether spirits exist. It was whether a person used subtle craft, means, or device to take money for a false demonstration. That wording is the hinge. The slate itself was not illegal. Britain did not outlaw school supplies in 1876. The Vagrancy Act dated back to 1824, and under it, the offense was deception for gain. Put the same slate in a classroom and it is nothing. Put it in a paid sitting with a dead child's name written across it, and suddenly it behaves like contraband. In court, conjurer J.N. Maskelyne demonstrated how such writing could be produced by natural means. His version used that thimble with a pencil point and elastic concealment. The importance of that demonstration was not that it proved Slade used that exact device on every occasion. It proved something more damaging. The feat belonged to the territory of manual trickery. Once a magician can reproduce the miracle with hidden hardware measured in fractions of an inch, the burden shifts. The medium no longer stands as the only explanation, and the numbers stay small all the way down. A pencil fragment, a thimble, a strip of elastic, a slate the size of a schoolroom prop, a fee of 20 shillings. Yet those tiny measurements produced enormous testimony, because the witness did not see a machine. The witness saw absence, hands above the table, slate below the table, scratching in between. The mind fills the gap. Slade was sentenced to 3 months hard labor. That is the official line the case entered the record with. Hard labor for messages from the dead written on a slate. But even that did not hold cleanly. The conviction was later quashed on appeal. The legal system reached for certainty, then lost its grip on it almost at once. This object is more than a Victorian curiosity. Every banned device in this story lives in that narrow strip between thing and claim. The hardware is often cheap. The setup is often visible. The mechanism can be reconstructed with household materials. But once the device is sold as proof, hard-won habits can vanish in a single sitting. Checking sequence, controlling the object, watching the hand instead of the story. Someone always benefits when that discipline disappears. The spirit slate never needed to be advanced. It needed to be ordinary. That was the engineering, not better materials, better assumptions. A sitter trusted the slate because it looked testable, and that appearance of transparency was the trick's strongest shield. Officially, Henry Slade's case was about fraud under the Vagrancy Act. On the table, it looked like chalk on stone. In practice, it was a commercial method for turning a schoolroom object into witness-grade evidence for the dead. Number 8. Spiritual Telegraph Dial. On August 18, 1855, in a hall meant for American science, Robert Hare sent in a letter he believed should change everything. Hare was not a fringe pamphleteer or a carnival lecturer. He was an emeritus professor of chemistry at the University of Pennsylvania, an old man with a long reputation and a habit of building apparatus to settle arguments. He had spent years with balances, valves, retorts, and measured reactions. Now he was asking the American Association for the Advancement of Science to hear evidence that spirits could operate instruments. The standing committee refused even to read the letter aloud. The subject, they decided, did not fall within the association's objects. The claim was not banned. It was left outside the room. By the time Hare was shut out, the machine at the center of his case had already done something subtle. It took the oldest seance spectacle, knocks under a table, raps in the dark, vague answers emerging one letter at a time, and recast it as instrument output. If that recasting were true, the consequences were brutally practical. A ghost would no longer need a gifted medium translating taps into speech. It could write. It could answer yes or no. It could select numbers. It could, at least in principle, leave messages as fast as a clerk could copy them down. Death would stop being a mystery to interpret and become a channel to consult. That possibility did not begin with Hare. It began on December 5, 1853, in Thompsonville, Connecticut, when Isaac T. Pease announced what he called the Spiritual Telegraph Dial. The name fit its moment. America was wiring itself together with telegraph lines, turning distance into pulses and code. Pease offered the same logic for the dead. His device was small, 8 inches square, about 2 inches thick on average, a box closer to a tabletop clock than a grand machine. Around the dial sat the 26 letters, Arabic numerals, yes and no, short stock phrases, even musical signs. In the center, a pointer. Under the claim sat a simple promise: stop wasting time calling out the alphabet and waiting for a rap after each letter. Let the table move. Let strings and pulleys transfer that motion. Let the message appear directly. In early 1854, newspapers could not decide whether they were seeing an invention or a punchline. On January 12th, the New York Daily Tribune ran with it in the tone Victorian editors reserved for ideas that were both absurd and somehow marketable. Help for the ghosts. On February 4th, Scientific American reprinted notice of the dial and Pease's boast that letters could be indicated as fast as an amanuensis can write it down. Hold on to that line. The claim was not merely that spirits could knock, not merely that believers felt presences. It was that a device could increase throughput, faster transcription, less ambiguity, better interface. This odd little box sits on the same bloodline as later talking boards. The innovation was not supernatural, it was ergonomic. It moved the seance away from performance and toward input and output. You ask, the apparatus responds. The body twitches, the pointer travels, and language seems to come out of furniture. Imagine the claim is true for one evening. You are in a parlor in 1854. No dramatic trumpets, no floating hands. Just a table, a compact dial, a pointer edging from letter to letter. Someone leans in and asks for a surname. It spells one, then an address. It gives a number, then whether a will is hidden behind a panel. Yes, the consequences arrive at once. Families would reopen estates. Courts would hear from widows with messages no living witness could verify. Mediums would become operators of a communications system. A dead relative would no longer be remembered. He would be consulted. Hare walked straight into that possibility because he thought he could break it. He approached spiritual manifestations as a man trained to catch error in apparatus. If a medium was cheating, controls should expose the cheat. So he took Pease's idea and hardened it. Screens, levers, pulleys, counterweights, arrangements in which the medium could not see the letters being indicated. He modified the dial into devices he renamed spiritoscopes. Once a Victorian investigator starts naming subtypes of machine, the argument has shifted. This is no longer a story about a spooky table. It is a story about instrumentation. He even described one setup in which a spring balance suggested a force equivalent to 18 pounds exerted without the normal visible reaction you would expect from the body producing it. To Hare, numbers like that were not garnish. They were forensic anchors. A machine had moved. A measured resistance had changed. A pointer had indicated characters hidden from the operator. Therefore, he believed, something outside ordinary muscular action was present. Here the pattern tightens. Knowledge does not disappear only when facts are destroyed. It also disappears when procedure is replaced by theater dressed as procedure. Hare added controls because he wanted to separate claim from trick, but the more mechanical the seance became, the more it borrowed the authority of science without acquiring its discipline. A dial face looks neutral, a pulley looks honest, a hidden letter ring looks severe. The whole event starts to feel insulated from human suggestion, even when the human body is still the only motor in the system. There was another problem. Pease's original dial may have been advertised, discussed, joked about, imitated, and absorbed into later designs, but it slips away the moment you reach for a clean material trail. We know the claim. We know the newspaper notices. We know Hare's modified copies and descriptions. What we do not neatly have is a confident world full of surviving original Pease dials in meaningful numbers. The object that promised direct transmission enters history like a signal with weak reception, loud in print, faint in the archive. So the years after 1853 leave a strange residue. A compact box, 8 inches by 8, tries to make the dead legible. A chemist with a serious name adopts it, fortifies it, and declares the fortified results persuasive. A scientific body does not rebut the spirits line by line. It simply declines the subject. The machine survives in a half-lit zone where ridicule and belief feed each other, too technical to dismiss as mere knocking, too compromised to admit as knowledge. exactly the kind of object that lets people feel they have skipped the slow apprenticeship of doubt. If the dial ever worked the way its makers implied, even once, the most unsettling part was not that the dead could speak, it was the format. They spoke through a system the living already trusted, the neat, ticking language of instruments. Years later, the claim itself had been turned away at the door. But in the imagination of the age, the pointer was still moving, one small click at a time around a silent face of letters. Number 7. Psychograph. On December 4, 1886, a spiritualist newspaper printed a correction so small it would be easy to miss. It also gives the whole device away. In the Religio-Philosophical Journal, readers were told they had been using Hudson Tuttle's psychograph the wrong way. Not the cardboard base, the wooden disc. Fingers on the disc, not on the square beneath it. That single instruction is the document to watch, because it shows exactly where the motion was meant to begin. The object itself was small enough to sit on a family's knees, about 9 inches square, a central wooden disc about 5 inches across, ball bearings underneath, a brass pointer above. Around the edge, the alphabet, the numbers 0 through 9, and a few blunt little verdicts already waiting to be turned into mystery. Yes. No. Goodbye. Don't know. For $1.25 prepaid from Berlin Heights, Ohio, Tuttle Publishing Company would send one through the mail. That price matters. This was not a seance cabinet or a custom medium's apparatus. It was cheap, portable, repeatable. A spirit interface flattened into cardboard and wood, sold far from the big lecture halls and city circles where 19th century spiritualism usually staged itself. You did not have to hire a trance speaker. You did not have to read faint pencil arcs from a planchette. You could order a square board from rural Ohio, gather a few relatives in the parlor, rest your fingertips on a polished disc, and wait for the pointer to stop on letters. The man behind it was not a stage magician in a rented room. Hudson Tuttle was born on October 4, 1836, in Berlin Heights, Ohio, and he died there on December 15, 1910. Farmer, writer, spiritualist lecturer, the kind of 19th century figure who seems to belong equally to a field, a printing press, and a seance table. In the early 1880s, he took a culture already obsessed with spirit communication and gave it better ergonomics. As the object became more elegant, it also became less ghostly and more mechanical. That was the trick. The psychograph sat in an uncanny middle ground between the planchette and the Ouija board that would later dominate parlors. It was self-contained like a machine, but dependent on fingertips, mechanical enough to feel trustworthy, human enough to absorb every tiny pressure, hesitation, and involuntary drift of the hand. It was exactly the kind of design that makes people stop feeling like they are guessing and start feeling like they are measuring. A year later, on December 3, 1887, Tuttle stepped in to defend it. Another printed piece, another artifact, another clue. By then, people were treating the psychograph as if the board itself might generate messages on command, and Tuttle pushed back. He insisted it was not an automatic talking machine. It had no independent power. It was, in his words, a delicate means. It required repeated sittings. It required patience. Most of all, it required the right person, a sensitive. Here, the device stops looking like a detector and starts looking like something stranger. Modern ghost gadgets usually promise the opposite. Push button, read output, trust display. Tuttle's psychograph never really claimed to detect spirits by itself. It worked through a participant. The machine was not the source of the message, the sitter was. Or, in spiritualist terms, the sitter was the door. Read those two surviving notices together, the 1886 instructions and the 1887 defense, and the contradiction sharpens. Here is an object sold like an improved instrument, yet explained like a ritual aid. It arrives prepaid in the mail, but only works if the right nervous system is touching it. It offers letters and numbers with the confidence of a dial, yet its inventor has to remind buyers that the board is not producing anything by itself. That matters because this entire video keeps circling the same wound. Why does hard-won knowledge that took generations to master vanish without a trace? And who benefits when it does? The psychograph offers one answer. Sometimes knowledge does not vanish, it gets bypassed. The long discipline of testing, controlling, doubting, and repeating gets replaced by something cheaper, a feeling of certainty, not proof, not measurement, a user experience. There is another odd detail in the archive. Only 4 original Tuttle psychographs are known to survive, and they differ in details. That is not what you expect from an object remembered so vividly in spiritualist history. Loud in print, faint in the material record. The same pattern shows up again and again with devices like this. They appear in ads, testimonials, arguments, and corrections. Then you go looking for the actual thing, and the trail thins out fast. Even its legal status blurs at the edges. Modern sellers and collectors sometimes repeat that Tuttle's psychograph was patented. The stronger historical trail describes it as manufactured and advertised, not securely patented. The better claim to a first patented spirit communication psychograph belongs to Adolphus Theodore Wagner in London, back in 1854. Even the story of who invented what, and under what authority, starts to smear the moment you press on it. The most unsettling document comes later. In 1903, the progressive thinker printed a reader's account that begins almost casually and ends somewhere much darker. She starts with a psychograph. Later she leaves it for automatic writing. Then the comforting fiction disappears, the fiction that a device sits between her and whatever is answering. The name that emerges is Frank, an unseen presence writing through her hand, not tapping, not spelling across a dial, writing directly. That progression is easy to miss, but it is the machine's real movement. First, the user places fingers on a disk. Then the disk seems unnecessary. First, the board gives structure. Then the structure falls away. If the psychograph was supposed to make spirit communication safer, cleaner, more legible than older methods, this testimony suggests the opposite. The apparatus did not contain the experience. It trained the user into it. You can almost feel the design logic in the room. Fingers resting on polished wood, the pointer drifting, letters accumulating one stop at a time. The board teaches small surrender, tiny movements, shared responsibility. No one person feels fully in control, so no one person feels fully responsible. Because the brass index seems to stand outside the body's own motions disappear from view. That is why the 1886 correction matters so much. Fingers on the moving disc, not on the base. The contact point was the mechanism. So the psychograph was more mechanically elegant than the crude image most people now have of talking boards. In some ways, it was a better interface than what came later. But elegance is not the same as survival. Ouija escaped the narrow world of spiritualist seriousness and became parlor entertainment, mass-produced and culturally indestructible. Tuttle's device stayed closer to doctrine, closer to the believer, closer to the claim that somebody sensitive was needed. That closeness may be exactly why it shrank in the archive. A toy can survive ridicule. A doctrine-dependent instrument has a harder life. Once the serious users disperse, the skill set goes with them. The object remains, but the operating world around it collapses. Then all that is left is cardboard, bearings, a pointer, and testimony that grows more troubling the longer you read. The psychograph did not fail because it looked foolish. It failed because it looked almost reasonable. A 9-inch board, a 5-inch disc, ball bearings, printed letters, a brass pointer, everything arranged to make invisible motion feel external and private suggestion feel engineered. It was not a detector in the modern electronic sense. It was a Victorian user interface for surrender. And in one surviving account, the board did not end the seance. It removed the last excuse. Number 6. Spirit Photography Camera. Boston, Washington Street, 1862. You sit down for a portrait and hold still because exposure takes time. The studio is ordinary. Tripod, lens, glass plate, chemical smell. Nothing glowing, nothing occult. Just William H. Mumler, an engraver turned photographer, asking you not to move. Then the plate is developed, and there they are. A pale face over your shoulder, a dead child at your side, a husband you buried only in a letter because there was no body to bring home. The trick was simple in concept, not a haunted machine. An ordinary camera, sold as if it could do one impossible thing, make absence visible. The timing was brutal. The American Civil War had left more than 600,000 dead. Families were carrying names, not remains. Empty sleeves, empty beds, no grave to stand over. So when Mumler began selling portraits that seemed to place the living beside the dead, he was not entering a novelty market. He was stepping into an open wound. You can feel why it worked. Photography already carried a strange authority. It looked mechanical, neutral. If the camera showed it, maybe it was there. A medium in a darkened room gave you a voice. A photograph gave you an object, something you could hold in your hands. A card mount, a face, a shape behind the sitter that should not exist, but did, at least on the plate. This is what set it apart from the boards and dials. The camera gained credibility by looking boring. Sitters could inspect it. They could look at the lens. They could watch the plate holder. The fraud, if it was fraud, did not need a skull-shaped box or hidden wires. It could hide in timing, in plate handling, in prior exposure, in darkroom control. The more ordinary the camera looked, the stronger the result became. Seen up close, the sale gets darker. Mummler was not really selling communication. He was selling confirmation. Not a knock on the table, not a pointer moving across letters. A face, your face beside theirs. A machine image of reunion. By 1869, that had made him famous enough, and suspicious enough, that New York finally moved. Mummler was arrested and brought before Justice Joseph Dowling on fraud charges. Not because spirit photographs were weird. New York had seen weird before. Because he was taking money for them. Real money, from real mourners, for a claim that sounded less like religion and more like a commercial service. The hearing lasted 7 days. This was not a one-afternoon moral panic. There was a courtroom, witnesses, technical arguments. Professional photographers testified that ghost images could be produced through manipulation in the photographic process, double exposure, reused plates, darkroom tricks. Different paths, same destination. A dead person added to the living after the fact. Then P.T. Barnum showed up, which is almost too perfect. Barnum, the great American showman, produced a fake spirit photograph of himself to demonstrate how easily the effect could be staged. Not in theory, in practice. Here, look, I can do it too. It sounds like the clean ending. Fraud exposed, trick explained, curtain down. It did not happen that way. The court had a narrower problem. It is one thing to show that spirit photographs can be faked. It is another to prove exactly how this photographer made this specific plate in each contested case. That gap between technical plausibility and legal proof was wide enough for Mummler to slip through. After 7 days, Justice Dowling dropped the case for lack of proof. That verdict drives the whole story. Not innocent, not vindicated, not supernaturally confirmed, just unproved. And unproved was enough. Mummler returned to Boston damaged, but not finished. His legal defense cost him $3,000, a huge sum, and he never really recovered financially. But the business did not vanish. The need had not vanished. Grief was still there. The market was still there. And the camera still looked like a machine that told the truth. In 1872, he advertised spirit photographs at 30 cents each, or 4 for $1. The pricing says plenty, not a sacred right, not a rare revelation, a menu, a repeatable product, consolation, scaled. Then came the image that locked him into history. Mary Todd Lincoln entered his Boston studio in 1872, veiled and using a pseudonym. She was not some anonymous believer. She was the widow of Abraham Lincoln, a woman whose son was dead, whose husband had been murdered. She walked quietly into a room with a camera and chemicals and hoped she probably knew better than to trust. She sat for the portrait. The developed image showed Abraham Lincoln's pale figure standing behind her, hands near her shoulders, as if the dead president had returned for one last protective pose. You do not need to believe it to understand its force. In one frame, the most photographed political martyr in America appears to come back for the most recognizable widow in America. Private grief and national grief collapse into a single picture. The image says the machine has done what history cannot. It has reversed separation. Here the deeper pattern comes into focus. The benefit was never just money, though money was there. The benefit was authority. If a medium tells you your husband is present, you can doubt the voice. If a camera tells you, the lie borrows the prestige of the entire photographic age. A generation spends decades learning what an image is, how a plate works, why a lens can be trusted more than memory. Then somebody steps into that trust, wearing the clothes of the machine. That is how these devices keep mutating. When one source of authority weakens, the next one arrives dressed as evidence. First, the seance cabinet, then the photograph, Later, even the methods used to expose fraud would come from another invisible world technology. In January 1922, Harry Price had 6 specially marked quarter plates prepared with X-ray marks to test British spirit photographer William Hope. Same promise of unseen forces, different side of the table. The hidden world was now being used against the hidden world. Mumler sits right at the hinge, early enough that photography still feels half miraculous, late enough that professionals already know how easily a plate can lie. His camera was not banned because it was too supernatural. It became infamous because it was too ordinary. The lens was real. The chemicals were real. The sitter was real. So the ghost could borrow reality too. The contradiction in that courtroom never fully disappeared. The methods were plausible. The repeated spirits were suspicious. The profit motive was obvious. But the exact mechanics stayed just out of reach. And for some clients, that may not even have mattered. Verification was one service. Consolation was another. Sometimes they were not buying proof at all. They were buying permission to look once more. So when you hold one of these images in your mind, do not picture a silly Victorian fad. Picture a machine that learned a dangerous lesson in media history. If people already trust the tool, you do not have to sell the lie very hard. You just have to place it gently beside their grief. And one witness at the 1869 hearing reduced the whole miracle to a method. These spirit photographs can be made by anyone acquainted with photography. Number 5. Kirlian Photography Device. On October 15, 1976, a fresh issue of Science lands on a desk under fluorescent light. Volume 194, issue 4262, pages 263 through 270. The title is dry enough to kill any miracle on contact. Image modulation in corona discharge photography. 3 names sit at the top: Pihek, Kyler, and Faust. No seance language, no soul talk, no healing halo. Just a paper printed in black ink, entering the room like a warrant. Across the table lie the images it threatens. Fingertips ringed in electric blue, leaves edged in fire, palms burning with what many people had started calling the human aura. For years, those pictures had been passed hand to hand, as if the invisible had finally agreed to sit still. This document opens in the cold language of control variables. Once you read it, the room does not feel the same. Wind the reel back to Krasnodar, 1939. A repair bench. High-frequency electrotherapy equipment opened up in pieces. Semyon Kirlian, an electrician, bends over the machine with the practical concentration of a man trying to make stubborn hardware behave. Then a spark jumps between electrode and skin. Tiny, bright, instant. Most accidents vanish as soon as they happen. This one leaves an afterimage. So he and his wife, Valentina, do what people always do when a strange effect refuses to leave them alone. They build around it. Film, metal electrode, high voltage. A hand laid near the plate. A fingertip pressed close. A leaf flattened into position. The current rises. The room darkens. Around the object, a corona blooms. Not solid light, not a beam, but a fringe. A crackling outline that looks alive because it dances at the edges. In 1961, the Kirlians published their first paper in the Russian Journal of Scientific and Applied Photography. The effect is no longer just an accident in a workshop. It has a date, a name, and images to carry it. The pictures do most of the work. A laboratory artifact can be explained. A photograph can be believed. Put a glowing hand in front of someone, and they do not see electrode geometry or skin conductivity. They see revelation, flattened into something you can hold. By the time the story crosses west, it arrives ready for an audience that wants exactly that. In 1970, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain packages Soviet research as a frontier of hidden powers. The setting does half the persuasion for free. Behind the Iron Curtain, closed institutes, unusual machines, a secret science half withheld from the rest of the world. Suddenly, Kirlian images are not just sparks on film. They are clues from a rival civilization that may have learned how to photograph forces ordinary medicine cannot touch. Now Los Angeles, UCLA, the Neuropsychiatric Institute. Between 1966 and 1978, psychologist Thelma Moss runs a largely unsanctioned parapsychology lab there. The room has the exact energy this story needs, academic enough to sound legitimate, marginal enough to let forbidden ideas breathe. She visits the Kirlians. She studies the photographs. She talks about auras, subtle bodies, healing energies, not as stage tricks, as possibilities. The scene fills quickly. Fingertips press onto plates, electrodes hum, film is exposed. People lean over the developing image, looking for emotional states, illness, exhaustion, spiritual force, anything that might explain why one corona looks ragged and another looks full and bright. In 1972, New York hosts the first Western Hemisphere conference on Kirlian photography, acupuncture, and the human aura. The title tells you exactly what is happening. Alternative medicine, parapsychology, and ancient energy maps are being tied together by one visual effect. In conference rooms and hotel halls, the images work exactly as they were built to work. They collapse distance. You do not need to understand voltage frequencies to feel the pull of a photograph that seems to show life itself spilling past the skin. Someone holds up a print. A fingertip flares like a tiny sun. A leaf appears to glow after damage. An audience that might never agree on doctrine can still agree on what the picture looks like. Then the package gets tighter. In 1974, Stanley Krippner and Daniel Rubin edit the Kirlian Aura, photographing the galaxies of life. 208 pages with a title that does not hide its ambition. Not discharge patterns, not edge effects, galaxies of life. You can almost hear the promise hardening. The machine is no longer just an imaging setup. It is becoming an interpreter. Put a body into it, and maybe it will tell you what orthodox instruments miss. Stay in the room long enough, though, and the room starts betraying itself. One operator swears the image changed after meditation. Another gets a different pattern with the same subject. A third adjusts frequency, voltage, plate pressure, electrode shape, and the corona changes again. Skin is dry one day, damp the next. Contact is firm, then partial. Sweat beads at the ridges of a fingertip, and the light crawls outward differently. The mystery looks deep until you watch how many ordinary things can move it. Even later, a U.S. patent issued on September 16, 1980, number 4,222,658, for a device claiming diagnostic use on human beings, would quietly admit the core headache. Different laboratories were getting different results because the setup itself kept changing. The hidden force was supposed to be in the body. Too often, it was in the apparatus. Back to the desk in 1976. Back to the paper that does not care how beautiful the images are. Pihek, Kyler, and Faust test fingertip corona photographs under controlled conditions. Moisture, pressure, contact, the mechanics of discharge. Variables that aura circles had treated as background noise become the main event. The dramatic shifts in the image do not need spirits. They do not need souls. They do not even need a medical mystery. They need skin, electricity, and a surface that is never as stable as believers want it to be. What looked like a living field around the body can be produced, enlarged, distorted, or diminished by the body's most ordinary facts. Picture the table again. On one side, the glowing prints that seem to bridge acupuncture, psychic research, and diagnosis. On the other, 7 pages in science, stripping that bridge down to corona discharge physics. The effect does not vanish. The images remain striking because they were always real images of a real electrical process. But the meaning drains out of them, and meaning was the expensive part. Without it, the same device starts sliding between categories. Part art tool, part paranormal relic, part medical claim nobody can quite stabilize. A fingertip goes onto the plate once more. The current lifts. The corona flowers around the skin exactly on schedule. One person in the room still sees a soul trying to announce itself. Another sees moisture along the ridges. The photograph develops between them, bright as ever. The hand is not moved yet. Number 4. E-meter. On January 4, 1963, federal officers walked into the founding Church of Scientology in Washington, D.C., with a seizure order in hand. They were not there for a glowing machine, a coffin-sized cabinet, or some theatrical brass-covered contraption. They came for a small box with a dial, a needle, and 2 metal cans. One person held the cans, while an auditor watched for tiny movements and assigned them meaning: hidden charge, buried trauma, the state of the mind, even the condition of the Thetan, Scientology's immortal spiritual being. At the center of the fight was one man whose name was already stamped onto the device: L. Ron Hubbard. By then, Hubbard had built an entire system around the machine. But the box did not begin with him. Its technical ancestry ran backward through Volney Matheson's electropsychometer, patented on July 27, 1954, and further back into galvanic skin response instruments that measured changes in the body's electrical resistance. Strip away the ritual language, and what remains is much less mystical, an ohm-meter-like reading from human skin, wrapped in a story big enough to swallow medicine, psychology, and salvation at once. The problem was not the current or the hardware. The court would later call the device harmless in itself. But a harmless machine can become a very effective lie when people are taught to treat the needle as knowledge. That was where Hubbard's machine crossed a line the government believed it could police. The seizure pulled in more than 100 e-meters. It also pulled in the real target, paper. Around 200 pieces of literature, nearly 20,000 pages, came with them into court. Manuals, bulletins, explanations, claims, promises. The case was not really about the meter sitting on a table. It was about what Hubbard and his organization had taught people to believe the meter was doing. If the device had been presented only as a ritual object, the fight would have looked different. But the literature around it spoke in the language of science and healing. That turned a religious tool into something the Food and Drug Administration could treat as a misbranded device. Not because it shocked people, not because it poisoned them, because people might trust it instead of seeking actual medical care. You can feel the legal ground shift under Hubbard there. For years, spirit-detecting devices tried to survive by sounding scientific, more measurable, more instrument-like. The moment they borrowed the authority of medicine, medicine's regulators came through the door. Hubbard tried to stand on both sides at once. In one frame, the e-meter was a technical instrument, precise enough to reveal hidden disturbances in a living body. The patent he later received on December 6, 1966, U.S. Patent 3,290,589, described a device for measuring changes in resistance of a living body. That wording matters. It sounds careful, mechanical, quantifiable. But the machine's importance did not come from electrical engineering. It came from interpretation. A twitch of the needle was never just a twitch. It was made to signify guilt, fear, memory, spiritual blockage, or unseen charge waiting to be exposed by an auditor trained to read the pattern. That made the machine slippery. The reading was real in the narrowest sense. Skin resistance can change. Sweat, pressure, grip, contact, stress, all of that can move a needle. But the leap from the body changed to this reveals a hidden spiritual truth is not a measurement. It is doctrine. By the late 1960s, Hubbard had a clear problem. If he insisted the e-meter was scientific, regulators could demand scientific proof. If he insisted it was medical, the burden got worse. If he moved it fully into religion, he could keep the ritual and lose the testable claim. The battle stopped being about whether the machine truly perceived anything invisible. It became a stranger American argument. Who gets to decide when a device is medicine, and when the same device becomes protected belief? On September 29, 1971, Judge Gerhard Gesell gave an answer that was both devastating and survivable. He condemned the seized e-meters and writings as misbranded. That was the official blow. The medical and scientific promises attached to them could not stand. But he did not erase the device. He drew a line through its authority. Secular therapeutic claims were forbidden. Use inside bona fide religious counseling could continue. That outcome was unusually strange. The state did not declare the machine a proven fraud in every possible sense. It declared something narrower, and in practice more durable. You may not sell this as medicine. You may not use this as science. But within religious counseling, the government would not sit in judgment on the truth of the doctrine underneath it. By then, Hubbard was no longer just defending a gadget. He was defending a category. If the e-meter stayed medical, it could be tested and broken. If it stayed scientific, it could be checked against reality. If it became sacramental, the needle no longer had to prove that it detected anything beyond the believer's framework. It only had to belong there. The case kept moving. On March 1, 1973, the D.C. Court of Appeals affirmed the basic result, but modified the order to avoid excessive entanglement between church and state. In plain terms, the courts would restrain the claims, not referee the theology. The warning that eventually accompanied the device said exactly what the law had forced into the open. The e-meter was not medically or scientifically useful for diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of disease. and yet the machine survived. That survival answers the darker question running under this story. Why does hard-won knowledge vanish without a trace, and who benefits when it does? Sometimes it does not vanish all at once. Sometimes it gets outflanked. Real expertise in physiology, measurement, and medicine remains on one side of the line. On the other side, a simpler story keeps the object alive by changing the kind of truth it claims to offer. Picture the table after the ruling. The cans are still there. The needle still moves. The person holding it still feels watched by a machine that seems to know more than it should. Officially, the court had stripped the e-meter of medical authority. In the room, in the ritual, on that table, it still held power over the people touching it. The government won the case against the claim. Hubbard kept the device by giving up exactly the part that could be tested. Officially, it was not a cure, not a diagnostic instrument, not science at all. In practice, that was the move that made it harder to kill. Number 3. Spiricom. On April 6, 1982, George W. Meek walked into the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., carrying 11 years of work behind him and a machine that claimed to do what seance cabinets, spirit trumpets, and talking boards had only hinted at. Not knocks, not vague impressions, a voice. Meek was a retired engineer and a leading figure in the Metascience Foundation. He presented Spiricom as if death had finally been reduced to electronics. A transceiver covering roughly 30 to 130 megahertz, 13 steady audio tones from 21 to 701 cycles per second, droning underneath like scaffolding. Wires, boxes, headphones, recordings. The promise was brutally simple. Give spirits enough raw acoustic material, and they could build speech out of it. In that story, the dead were not unreachable. They were underpowered. Meek had been chasing some version of that idea since 1970, when he started building the Mark I prototype in a small lab outside Philadelphia. Those early attempts went nowhere. The story shifted when he met William "Bill" O'Neill, an electronics man who said he brought something the hardware did not: mediumistic ability. That detail matters. Spiricom was never really sold as a normal machine. Its own theory said the circuitry opened the door, but a gifted operator supplied the energy. Bioplasmic was one of the words used. From the start, success could be credited to the system, while failure could be blamed on the missing human element. The mechanism looked technical, but the escape hatch was built in. By September 17, 1977, O'Neill said he had made two-way audio contact with a spirit called Doc Nick. Later, the star witness on the other side became more impressive. Dr. George Jeffries Mueller, a real man, an academic who had died in 1967 and was now described as Spiricom's technical advisor from beyond the grave. Meek and O'Neill would eventually claim more than 20 hours of two-way conversations with him. That number does a lot of work. It sounds too large for a fluke and too specific for a rumor. You picture reels of tape, careful logs, a voice returning night after night through the same electrical fog. That is how Spiricom wanted to look, not like a miracle, like a protocol. Start with the sound bed. 13 tones, constant and loud. The public transcript of the recordings admits this, warning listeners that the alleged spirit voices are difficult to understand because of the heavy 13-frequency background. That is the first clue. The machine is supposed to make the dead audible. Instead, its own operation floods the recording with so much noise that listeners need a transcript to know what they heard. The evidence is doing double duty. It is offered as proof of contact, and it also provides cover. Anything indistinct can be treated as mysterious. Anything clear can be treated as extraordinary. Then the radio side. The Mark IV's transceiver sat in the 30 to 130 megahertz range. That sounds impressive. Numbers like that usually do. But radio hardware, by itself, is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence of radio hardware. Spiricom's claim lived in the combination. Frequencies below, frequencies above, and O'Neill in the middle, acting as the living bridge between machine and ghost. When others tried to repeat the result and failed, that failure did not actually damage the core story. The machine alone was never supposed to be enough. Replication became a test Spiricom could always sidestep. Look at the sessions themselves. In surviving video described by skeptics, O'Neill is often turned away while the spirit voice speaks. At first glance, that helps the performance. If he is not facing the microphone, maybe the sound is not coming from him. But the rhythm is hard to ignore. The two voices do not overlap. O'Neill speaks, then the other voice comes in. The other voice speaks, then O'Neill answers. It behaves less like an open channel and more like turn-taking. Very neat turn-taking. Too neat. The voice matters even more. In January 1987, Terence Peterson wrote in Fate that the so-called Mueller voice resembled an electrolarynx. That is the handheld device some people use after losing their natural voice box. Mechanical, buzzing, metallic, with speech riding on top of a steady artificial vibration. David Rivers of Baylor duplicated a similar sound. Once you hear that possibility, the whole texture shifts. What had been sold as a man speaking from beyond death begins to sound like a living throat borrowing a machine's rasp. Here the design starts to collapse under its own weight. The 13 tones were supposed to help spirits form words, but they also masked intelligibility. The gifted operator was supposed to enable contact, but he also made clean replication impossible. The ghost advisor was supposed to add credibility, but his voice arrived in a form skeptics could imitate with known technology. Every important feature had two jobs, one public, one protective. And the timeline gets worse. The National Press Club demonstration happened on April 6, 1982. That was the public unveiling, the moment Spiricom stepped onto a national stage as proof of survival after death. But skeptical reporting says communication with Dr. Mueller had already stopped in November 1981, 5 months earlier. So the machine reached the world after the voices had already gone silent. Picture the room. Reporters, recordings, technical language, years of development. But the live event is gone. What remains are tapes from a vanished window that no one else can reopen. That is not how a breakthrough behaves. It is how a relic behaves. You can feel belief tightening around the machine. If the voices are present, the machine works. If the voices vanish, the conditions changed. If outsiders fail, they lack the right operator. If the audio is unclear, spirits are struggling against the limits of matter. Spiricom was built to resist disproof, because the essential component was never just the box on the table. It was the man beside it, the one person who could make the dead speak, and the one person no one could replace. The narrower answer is less grand than the legend. Spiricom did not prove that death could be tuned like a station. It produced recordings, a highly specific operator, a loud engineered backdrop, and a voice later argued to match an electrolarynx-style buzz. Whether O'Neill was deliberately faking, half-believing, or drifting between performance and self-deception is harder to pin down. Intent usually is. The mechanics are less slippery. When the hardware, the operator, and the spirit all point back toward the same human bottleneck, the mystery shrinks fast. Still, one image remains. A man in a room full of electronics, turned slightly away, waiting for a dead engineer to use his machine before the tape runs out. Through the bed of those 13 tones, something answers. It sounds disturbingly manufactured. Number 2. Frank's Box. On October 20th, 2014, 2 Frank's boxes were put up for sale less than 10 weeks after their maker died in Littleton, Colorado. One listing said both units had been built in 2013. The asking price was not the point. The date was. Frank Sumption died on August 16, 2014, at age 60. Almost overnight, a homemade radio scanner stopped being gear and became inventory from a closed world. By then, the originals were already scarce. The number repeated most often is about 180, hand-built over years, not mass-produced, not lined up in retail boxes, not pushed through chain stores. About 180 devices, one man. Born November 5, 1953, dead August 16, 2014. Those are the first clues, because they tell you what people were really buying. Not plastic and wire. Access. Start with the mechanism. AM and FM bands are full of fragments. Talk radio, music, ads, half a weather report, a preacher cut in half by static. Frank's box swept through that clutter rapidly, fast enough that no single station held for long. Slow enough to spit out syllables, names, little accidents of language. Believers called the dead the others. The promise was that the others could seize those fragments and arrange them in real time. Not record now and analyze later. Not hours of hiss on a cassette. Immediate reply. Ask a question. Hear an answer. That shift turned ghost hunting from delayed interpretation into live performance. In 2002, in Colorado, Sumption built the first one after experiments with EVP and radio noise. His own claim went beyond circuitry. He said the design had been given to him by spirits. From the start, the authority of the device sat in two places, inside the box and outside ordinary proof. If the idea came from the dead, then technical objections were no longer just technical objections. They were objections to the source itself. Now strip the legend down to numbers. About 180 originals, especially rare variants called video boxes. 5. That number creates a relic economy by itself. A scarce object is harder to test at scale, but easier to romanticize. If only a few people have one, failures stay private and successes travel. If the maker chooses who gets a unit, ownership starts to look less like purchase and more like initiation. No regulator has to ban the object. Scarcity does the work. That was Sumption's filter. He did not flood the market. He hand-built and selectively distributed. The machine picked up the aura of a forbidden device without the paperwork of an actual prohibition. No court order, no federal seizure, no official blacklist. But try to get an original after 2014, and the effect is almost the same. The circle closes. The source is gone. The number is fixed. The remaining boxes become authenticated pieces of a story that cannot be reproduced on demand. In 2003, paranormal investigator Chris Moon claimed he used a Frank's box in an investigation and treated it as a breakthrough, not a passive detector, a live telephone to the dead. The timeline matters. Built in 2002, publicly framed as a field tool in 2003. The device did not spend a decade crawling from hobby project to legend. The legend attached almost immediately because the use case fit television-era ghost hunting perfectly. A dark investigation, a question into the room, a second of waiting. Then a human-sounding fragment cracks through the speaker. The room takes over. The room always takes over because the core mechanism is brutally simple. Rapid radio scanning produces broken broadcast audio. Skeptics pointed out exactly that. Sweep across enough stations and language will appear. Names will appear. Tiny hits will appear, especially when listeners are primed, emotional, and already searching for a response. The machine does not have to generate coherent speech from nowhere. It only has to throw enough material at the brain for the brain to finish the sentence. You can measure the asymmetry. One box. Hundreds of radio fragments per minute. One investigator asking leading questions. Several listeners waiting for confirmation. The dead do not need to win every exchange. They only need one good coincidence every few minutes. One yes. One first name. One clipped phrase landing at the exact right second. That ratio is unbeatable for theater. Misses dissolve into noise. Hits get replayed. Why did Frank's box hit harder than older EVP systems? Timing. With tape-based EVP, the ritual came later. You recorded in the dark, then spent hours reviewing hiss and silence. Frank's box collapsed the delay to zero. Zero review time between question and answer. The machine felt less like analysis and more like contact. Once ghost hunting becomes live conversation, the operator becomes part host, part interpreter, part ventriloquist for randomness. Knowledge that took generations to build in radio engineering gets repurposed in a single move. Frequency scanning becomes seance choreography. Years later, commercial descendants spread the concept everywhere. In 2015, a PSB-7 Spirit box could be listed at $69.90, an SB-11 at $138.90. The drop is telling. Sumption's originals were scarce because one man made about 180 by hand. The descendants were products, cheaper, cleaner, easier to order. The idea escaped the relic and entered the market, but that did not make the original less powerful. It made the original more sacred. When copies are common, provenance matters more. People stop asking whether the method works and start asking whether this was built by Frank. Frank's box was never mainly protected by law. It was protected by story. Built in 2002, validated in 2003, limited to around 180 units. Maker dead in 2014. Rare subtypes counted on one hand. Cheap descendants on sale by 2015. Those numbers track a transition from experiment to legend to commodity. Each stage solved a different problem. The experiment created the claim. Scarcity created desire. Mass-market copies created an industry. So when people call the original forbidden, they often mean something narrower and stronger. Not officially banned, but socially gated, technically ambiguous, and impossible to separate from the man who made it. You can hear the pattern from the other side now. Put a listener in a dark room, sweep enough frequencies, give them grief, expectation, and a box with a dead inventor's name on it. The line between transmission and interpretation gets very thin. The most important component was never the speaker, or the tuning circuit, or even the band scan. It was ownership of the ritual. Who asks? Who listens? Who decides that a clipped vowel was a reply, and not a radio host from 2 towns over? After Sumption died, the originals did not disappear. They hardened. About 180 became a ceiling. 5 became a myth. The machine that promised instant access to the dead ended up proving something much more ordinary and much more durable. Broken radio fragments scale better than evidence. 5 video boxes. Number 1. Ovilus. On October 17, 2015, in Liberty, Missouri, the crew of Ghost Adventures walked into the old Oddfellows home for the Oddfellows Asylum lockdown, carrying a device that looked less like seance equipment than a chunky field meter. No planchette, no trumpet, no spinning dial, just a handheld box with a speaker. In the dark, they asked their questions, waited a beat, and the machine answered in clean synthetic words. Nick. Paula. Out. Funeral. In a building already saturated with death, illness, and institutional memory, those 4 words did exactly what they were meant to do. They turned a mood into a message. Take the claim at face value for a second. If this thing were real in the strong sense, not as atmosphere, not as coincidence, but as an actual channel, the consequences would be brutally practical. A $599 handheld unit, or $579.19 on sale when listed with 56 reviews, would mean the dead no longer require gifted mediums, special locations, or one-off miracles. You could walk into any room, switch modes, and ask for names. Hospitals, crime scenes, old family homes. The barrier between memory and testimony would collapse into a rechargeable consumer device with a battery life of 12 to 20 hours. That is not just spooky, that is a forensic revolution. The Ovilus was built to feel scientific, precisely because it does not behave like a radio seance box. Its lineage runs through Bill Chappell and the digital dowsing line, where each generation added polish, vocabulary, and menus. The original Ovilus one was sold as a handheld device that took energy readings and turned them into speech. 7 modes, a 512-word list. Later came the Ovilus Effects with a 1,024-word dictionary, 9 modes, and a replay buffer for the last 1,000 words spoken. By the time you reach the Ovilus 5, the pitch is cleaner and, in a way, more dangerous. No random generator, just environmental changes mapped to one of 2,048 predefined words. It sounds tighter, more disciplined, less chaotic. But look at what changed. Frank's box asked you to believe a voice survived the static. The Ovilus asks for something smaller and easier to grant. Something in the room changed, and the device translated that change into language. Not a ghost shouting through AM fragments, a system, a table, a conversion. The company's own material makes the mechanism plain. In dictionary mode, the device is not listening for speech at all. It is selecting from a preloaded word list. The manual for the video Ovilus gives a blunt example. If the calculated value is 100, the 100th word is spoken. That step changes the whole frame. The mystery is no longer, where did the voice come from? It becomes, what caused the number? Those are different questions. You can see why that distinction disappears on camera. You are in a former asylum. The lights are low. The crew asks who is present. A box answers with a proper name. They ask what happened here. The box says, funeral. The exchange feels immediate because the machine compresses a chain of interpretation into a single beat. Sensor fluctuation becomes a number becomes a word becomes a reply. By the time it reaches the audience, the middle is gone. That middle is everything. The Ovilus does, in fact, function. It is not fake in the cheap sense where nothing happens. Something always happens. Sensors register changes. Software assigns outputs. The speaker produces words. The user receives language. but a machine that reliably converts noise, drift, or ambient variation into vocabulary is not proving contact. It is manufacturing legibility. It takes the oldest weakness in paranormal investigation, the human need to find signal and ambiguity, and gives it a firmware update. By the Ovilus 5B, that ecosystem had spread into 8 modes: dictionary, energy, draw, true/false, motion, phonetic, log, and its proximity settings workflow. More functions mean more chances to feel that the device is adapting to the room. More modes mean more ways to ask, re-ask, and reinterpret until the answer lands. If some versions allow the word environment to be shaped or loaded from predetermined vocabulary, the problem gets worse, not better. The machine is not merely selecting language from a closed set. It may be selecting from a closed set already tilted toward names, danger, death, religion, or the body, exactly the categories most likely to feel charged after the fact. The Ovilus sits at the peak of this whole segment. Earlier devices needed spectacle. They needed spinning pointers, hidden slates, spirit trumpets, radio sweep, chemical fog, or the old stagecraft of mediumship. This one arrives in the costume of instrumentation. It looks like measurement. It speaks in clipped, synthetic calm. It gives the modern investigator what every banned or sidelined spirit device was always chasing, not just mystery, but procedure. So picture the operator trying to be honest. They are not necessarily lying. Bill Chappell did not need to hide a ghost in the box for the box to work exactly as advertised. If environmental readings select one word out of 2048, then yes, the process can be deterministic. Skeptics can accept that completely and still reject the paranormal leap. Deterministic does not mean meaningful. It only means the route from input to output is fixed. Here is where the trap closes. Once the Ovilus speaks, investigators almost never evaluate the thousands of words it could have said, but did not. They evaluate the one word it did say in a room already packed with cues: an asylum, a winery built on old institutional ground, a crew primed for contact, an audience trained to notice names and death terms. Out becomes eviction. Paula becomes identity. Funeral becomes confirmation. The machine does not have to know what any of those words mean. The people holding it do that work for free. If you want one grounded answer to the larger question, who benefits when hard-won knowledge vanishes and is replaced by something easier, faster, more marketable? Look here. Real instrumentation takes generations to build, calibrate, test, and doubt. This box skips the doubt. It sells interpretation in the shape of a tool. Because it is sold in the language of sensors rather than seances, the old ritual survives inside a newer shell. The plainest detail may be the strangest one. The manual says it is sold as an entertainment device only. It advises that children under 18 should not use it. The machine that entered haunted locations as a translator of the dead arrived with a disclaimer that already knew what it was: entertainment device only.